Please help me welcome our next gubernatorial candidate, Lieutenant Governor of California, Gavin Newsom.
Nice to see you. Morning, everybody. Sorry about that. I just got out of the car, so long trip up.
Well,
How are you?
Thanks for making the trek. Did you come from San Francisco?
I did. It was an accident, though, so it was a 2.5-hour drive.
Welcome to California.
God bless. Yeah. Talk at the Transportation Summit next, yeah.
Well, thanks again for making the time. Excited to talk to you today about housing. As you know, California is in an unprecedented housing and affordability crisis. We'd like you to just start out by talking about what specifically your solutions are to this problem and what you would do during your first year.
Well, you got to build more housing, supply-demand imbalance. You got to begin by stating goals, having demonstrable leadership, holding folks accountable to achieving those goals, convening people not once a year at a summit, but on a consistent basis, being punitive where you have to be, to make sure local government's actually achieving their goals, incentivizing others so there are no barriers to exercising their effort. I think fundamentally what's been missing is all of the above. While the Department of Housing and Community Development has a goal of 1.8 million housing units by 2025, that's not going to solve anything. It's a nice goal, but that's around failing more efficiently. If you've got a crisis, and we all acknowledge a crisis, we acknowledge on the fact that we're 49th out of 50th in the United States in per capita housing units. Only Utah can lay claim to being the lowest in per capita production. Doubling that production on an annual basis is not going to do anything. If 50+% of folks can't afford housing, low income, 100% can't afford housing, then you've got to be audacious. Now, the problem with being audacious is no one thinks it can be done. You have, experts that say, we have not achieved goals since 1954. By the way, that's the same year that Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile. Just interesting. And the point of that is to make this point. I don't mean to be dismissive. I don't need to belittle folks. But if you guys are interested in playing in the margins, I promise you, every single one of you should get on your social media and encourage all your friends and family not to support my candidacy for governor. You have to be as bold as this problem is big. And, I know there's a lot of hysterics around that McKinsey report that came out last year. But I appreciated that report. I read every single word in that report. A deep dive looking at California in 34 housing regions, identifying 5+ million housing opportunities, specific strategies, specific goals to achieve it. We laid out in the spirit of that report, in the spirit of the work that I did as mayor, the spirit of the work that I'm doing with a team of policy advisors, we laid out specific ideas, specific strategies on enhanced infrastructure financing districts, specific strategies to increase our low-income housing tax credit from $85 million to $500 million, specific strategies to advance the framework around categorical exemptions for socially desirable projects, to focus on issues of land use fiscalization and upzoning, and to look at secondary housing units and accessory dwelling units, to look at programmatic EIRs, to specifically look at strategies to address the missing middle, and those are folks earning 80 to 120, 80 to 140% of AMI, opportunities to engage in the private sector to generate financing around those strategies, all in addition to supporting that $4 billion housing bond, in addition to continuing our strategies here in Sacramento to encourage the kind of work that Scott Wiener is doing, which I actually applaud. He's leaning in. He's focusing on density in the spirit of SB 375 and focusing on land use housing and land housing linkages, sustainable communities. All of that, forgive my long-windedness, all of that I think is inherently a requirement, table stakes, for the next administration if we're going to get out of this rut and get serious about this crisis in this state.
We do have a lot of ground to cover, so just like to get your response to the fact that it's not government, however, that builds housing. You want to build 3.5 million new homes, but doesn't that rely on the market and private investment?
Yep.
How can you deliver on your promise?
Well, policy is an accelerator. Got to create the conditions. You're 100% right. It's not top down, it's bottom up. Localism at the end of the day is determinative. And unfortunately now the incentives aren't lined for good local decision making. Mayors, as you know, they may say one thing, but they consistently do otherwise. Mayors may claim they care about housing, but mayors really care more about retail because they capture sales tax increment. Counties capture property tax. That's not a good incentive for good behavior. And I know these are tectonic plates to shift the allocation of funding, but I think substantively, unless we're not having that debate about allocating resources differently, we're not having a real debate about incentivizing good local decision making. We're our own worst enemies. And 2/3 of the housing challenge is concentrated in about 4 regions of this state. Those 4 regions have one thing in common. They're among the most restrictive regions in terms of housing production. And in so many ways, we have got to address those barriers. And I know, again, that goes back to what Scott's doing and some others are leaning into that, and I think in a very meaningful and substantive way. And I admire that. I admire that kind of ingenuity, that kind of resolve. I think it's required at this moment.
What kind of funding commitment do you think is needed, and what would you be willing to do in terms of an ongoing funding
Well,
source?
we talked about that on the low-income housing side. It's profoundly important now, as you all know, even more today than it was 3 months ago after the corporate tax cuts that really are going to dry up, I think, significantly the tax credit market, that California supplement that. Right now, I think it's about $85 million that we appropriated in our low-income housing tax credits. As I noted in my opening, I want to see that phased up to about $500 million. The reason why is, as you all know well, you're the experts, we generate anywhere from 2 to 3 to 1 ratio in terms of drawing down federal resources. That's $1.5 billion to $2 billion that we're able to capture. Bringing back a form of redevelopment that's a little bit more targeted, a little bit more specific. That's where I'm more interested in what we can do. Truckee does it interestingly. Truckee does it well, which is interesting. San Diego does it reasonably well with EIFDs. But these enhanced infrastructure financing districts, it's a way of capturing tax increment. It's intriguing, taking them to the next level. I think it's important. I've long supported, a couple years ago, I came out very, very aggressively for a statewide bank. It's beyond me, except for the obvious reason, why we don't have a state bank that could significantly provide the kind of reinvestment in our diverse communities up and down the state that otherwise is not afforded because of the way we do bank with the private sector. I think there are many mechanisms to which we can induce better behavior at the local level and induce private sector investment.
Even that investment, though, say redevelopment comes back and we get the $4 billion housing bond for this November, that's not going to meet the $3.5 million, that goal that you've laid out. Would you be willing to go to the general fund?
Yeah, I mean, well, the general fund is certainly part of that 85 to 500 million, so the answer by definition was yes. No, but look, it's not government. We're not going to subsidize our way out of this problem. You've got to incent your way out of this problem. And there's, look, the demand, the supply imbalance is such that there's all the incentive in the world for the private sector, if they're given some certainty in the process and they address their risk, and there's capital that's accessed, and we can develop a workforce around that we'll have plenty of investment that is made in this space. And then the ROI on that is extraordinary in terms of the stimulus as it relates to the local economy and the broader economy. So no, again, we are achieving plus or minus 100,000 housing units on an annual basis. It's not enough. That's not all coming from the state of California. It's not going to come from the state of California going forward and double it, triple it. We're going to have to incentivize private sector investment. And that's also, by the way, let's be honest, it's modular housing, it's spec housing with the caveat, because I know half the labor folks in this room, are now tweeting that they're outraged by that, with the caveat that we protect our trades in the context of the development of that modular housing and spec housing. This is the one sector, your sector, of the economy that hasn't seen significant productivity improvements in the last half century. It's one of the few, if only, sectors of our economy that hasn't seen significant productivity enhancements. And that's something else we have to work on from a workforce training perspective, also from a materials perspective, and a design and construction perspective.
We could turn to the not in my backyard phenomenon that has contributed to this problem. It's no secret that there's tension between locals and the state. How would you address, balance those tensions?
You gotta hold mayors accountable to their general plans, their housing element. I like what the MTC is doing in Northern California. They're beginning to do that as it relates to transit funding. Got to compel better behavior. It's carrots and sticks. Look, I'm a former mayor. I get this. Do I ever get it? Lived it. By the way, I lived it in a very different way than any other mayor because I was a mayor of a city and a county. I saw both sides of this equation. And, there was no penalty for bad behavior.
How would you change that?
Back to what Scott's doing and what others are doing. They're compelling a different conversation, a different argument. SB 827 is starting to focus on as-of-right zoning and upzoning around transit corridors. These are different kind of conversations, and I think they're interesting conversations, but as I specifically said, answer your question, even in an attempt to answer it before you asked it, was the framework around linking transit funding as regions are doing in the Bay Area, particularly through the MTC, that's responsible for a lot of that allocation, and incentivizing better behavior and compelling that housing production.
A lot of Californians are leaving. We're seeing middle-class people leaving, low-income families displaced from rural cities and cities like San Francisco. What do you see as the answer to
everything we just said?
For renters?
For renters, it's profoundly significant. So look, you've got a production issue, we've got a preservation issue, which we don't talk enough about. That's a deep issue. And then we've got a prevention issue, sort of the 3 Ps of housing. And on the prevention side, I come from a rent-controlled city. One size doesn't fit all, I get that. We had aggressive Ellis Act protections, owner move-in protections. We doubled down on our legal prevention funds or protection funds and counseling services, and we've got to do more of that.
Landlords are still getting around those protections.
Exactly, and that's why good enough never is, and we're continuing to do more. San Francisco does as much or more than any other city in the state of California, but the macroeconomic headwinds are profound and significant. You haven't asked yet, which is just as well, Costa-Hawkins debate. She couldn't walk 1 square foot at the Democratic Convention without a lot of you that were in this room protesting the status quo. I think there's an opportunity potentially, I know it was killed in committee, to find some common ground on that. I think there are areas we can find common ground. Not everyone agrees with that, but most folks I talk to seem to think that we're past a point of crisis as it relates to affordability, and what's happening with tenants is profoundly significant, and it's in everyone's best interest to perhaps find some consensus and compromise. Getting rid of these protections overall, I think, may have unintended consequences on housing construction and production that could be profoundly problematic. So I would hope if there's an opportunity to find consensus that we can get there.
If it qualifies for the ballot, will you vote in favor?
I'm not going to say that until I read it and see what qualifies.
Okay. If we could turn to homelessness, issue you're no stranger to. In San Francisco, you tried to reform the city and address the problem, yet it grew under your watch, and it's growing statewide. It
declined under my watch by 40%. The street population, the overall population declined 33%. Last year, it started to come back up. The street population substantially was reduced, and we got over 12,000 people off the streets in the most significant supportive housing production and construction of any city, I argue, in the country. And that may be a little bit of a PolitiFact exaggeration, but only modestly, certainly anywhere in California, not even close. It was a housing-first model. Shelter solves sleep, housing solves homelessness. housing, and supportive services. That should be the emphasis. That should be our frame. Rapid rehousing, housing first model. We call it a direct access to housing model. I've laid out a detailed homeless strategy. There's been no intentionality on homelessness in this state for decades. It's not been a focus of the state of California. It is a disgrace. It's the ultimate manifestation of our failure as a society, and it happened on our watch. And that has to change with the next administration. You may not like me, but please hold your next governor accountable to doing something substantively on this. It cannot be solved at the local level. It is challenging at the regional level. The state of California needs to back things up. We have an aggressive SSI plan. I think the biggest investment, the biggest ROI on investment is getting people into SSI. Our focus is on whole person care. We have a pilot that we've been running in the state that needs to be significantly advanced. That's using Medi-Cal dollars very, very differently. Also Medi-Cal dollars differently on assisted living. We also have an in-reach plan, and that's addressing the issue that some are pointing to around Prop 47, 57, 3 strikes, or AB 109, and everyone's scapegoating their problem by claiming that it's around our criminal justice reforms. Well, if that's the case, then let's get serious about people pre-release being connected to services and programs. And as someone that sponsored the cannabis legalization initiative, which I know not everyone here was supportive of, I hope you're supportive of this. 60%, I know we're all closing, of the money,
Still have two more things. Quick.
60% of that money is dedicated back into counties, which is a significant amount of money, for alcohol and drug treatment as well as brain health services to significantly increase our investment in behavioral health and drug and alcohol residential programs. It is one of the great new investments that this state has seen in decades, and I'm very, very proud of that, and that's something we can build on together.
Since we're a little ahead of time, I just want to take two more questions and have you respond. So under your watch, you drafted and promised to, quote unquote, end homelessness with your 10-year plan to address homelessness in San Francisco. I wonder what you learned and what you think in terms of what didn't work and what didn't happen.
So every state in the country signed 10-year plans to end chronic homelessness. So it was a national effort, and I absolutely am proud we committed to that effort. And I think one of the biggest mistakes we make in life, and it's a great frame for politicians because it's the gotcha frame, but the greatest thing that I've learned in the private sector, and some of you know I come from the private sector. I have 23 small businesses, about 750 employees, and I honestly am not saying that to impress you, but impressed by an entrepreneurial spirit. The biggest thing I learned from that experience is that the biggest risk in life, Michelangelo said this, is not that you aim too high and miss it. It's that you aim too low and reach it. And I say that to make this point. Small ball goals don't stretch the imagination. You don't discover who you're capable of being with small goals. You discover who you're capable of being by being audacious and having moonshots. And I think if we didn't have that 10-year plan to end chronic homelessness, we wouldn't have come close to providing as many supportive housing units and getting as many people off the streets as we did. And I think the same spirit needs to come into this housing debate. And that's something I think all of us should encourage our elected officials not to play small, not when we're dealing with an actual legitimate crisis of affordability that's driving 8 million people into poverty, 46% of our children at or near poverty, that's driving, as you say, Angela, the middle class out of this state. This is a profoundly important moment. The businesses of this state are complaining about this issue more than any other issue. It's driving the economy into the doldrums in parts of this state that are in real crisis. And I think we have an obligation to be bold and to be audacious, to be aggressive. So that's what I learned. Double down on audacity.
Did you make mistakes in San Francisco that you might learn from?
Oh, well, that is something we'll need a few hours to go over on many subjects.
On homelessness?
No, I think we made a mistake in this respect. I was too slow to move away from the continuum of care. I bought into, and I know half of you are like, well, hold on, I'm deep into the continuum of care. I learned too late that we were managing the problem, not solving the problem. And we were wasting, quite literally, hundreds of millions of dollars a year on managing, not solving the problem. And the biggest mistake I made is I bought into that frame. I bought into that mindset. And the other thing I bought into is that more is always better. as a good Democrat, a good progressive, I always think more is always better. So the problem can only be solved by spending more money. And one of the things we did in San Francisco that I participated in for almost a decade was providing cash assistance to people that were self-declared as homeless, but an insignificant amount of money to get them the housing, which was the underlying reason they were out in the streets in the first place. And it took me a few years to have the courage to do something called Care Not Cash. And I regret that we took so long because people's lives suffered because of that. And I think on the continuum of care, we're much better off noting that if you're doing a drug and alcohol outpatient program for someone who lives under a freeway overpass, I'm not sure those dollars are being well invested. I think you're much better off investing in a supportive housing unit, stabilizing that individual, and then dealing with that substance use problem in a stabilized environment. And those are the things I regret when I look back on the issue.
In closing, and thanks again for the time, we've talked a lot about solutions that are city-focused issues. How would you work to address the housing challenges in the rural parts of California?
Well, all of this includes the rural parts of the state. And that's why, again, the McKinsey deep dive was interesting because it identified these 34 housing regions in the state and have unique solutions that are tailored for each part of the state. I would call it regions rising together as opposed to the state vision being realized at the state level. It's now realized at the local level. So that goes into programmatic EIRs, that goes into as-of-right zoning, that goes into different spec strategies and modular strategies. It goes into how infrastructure financing can work differently. It goes into how inclusionary housing works very differently on the coast, cities like mine, versus how they may work in other parts of the state that are without them or not even interested in them, or in lieu fees work, in the differentiation. So you've got to customize solutions based upon all of those things. I have a bias for density, but I also respect our diverse communities, and I respect what makes California unique and special. And that's why disproportionate emphasis around transit, not destroying the rural fabric, but also reconciling the fact that we have to lean towards a framework of density versus the framework of sprawl if we're going to achieve that twin goal, and that is radically changing the way we produce, consume energy, and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as we significantly improve and increase our production. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. I know it's a lot to get to in a short amount of time. Oh,